you, and welcome to today's installation of our DoD History Program speaker series. This is a real treat for me. I've introduced many speakers, but rarely do I get the opportunity to introduce someone that I've always looked up to. When we all go through graduate school, scholars too have our heroes, people we want to be like, and Eliot Cohen was that person for me. Evidently, I picked a good person because Secretary Mattis and the chairman also said they were going to try to come to today's event. If they couldn't, they did ask that we get them the videotape. So you are really in for a special event today. I'd first, however, like to point out the gentleman in the audience. Mark, if you could stand up. Dr. Mark Moyer. Without him, we wouldn't have Eliot here today. Mark is the Director of the Military and Diplomatic History Program at the Center for International and Strategic Studies, CSIS, and he helped us get Eliot here today, so thank you, Mark, for that. So Eliot, you need little introduction, but for those of you who do not know Professor Cohen, he is the Osgood Professor of Strategic Studies at Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, SICE. He received both his BA and PhD from Harvard University, where he then went on to teach. He's also taught at the Naval War College. His list of publications are simply too numerous I could take up 10 minutes listing them all. So I'll just let you know that what he's talking about today is his most recent book entitled The Big Stick, The Limits of Soft Power and the Necessity of Military Force. Eliot served in the U.S. Army Reserve. He was director at one time in the Defense Department's policy planning staff. He led the Air Force study of the First Gulf War. He served in various official advisory positions. From 2007 to 2009, he was counselor of the Department of State, serving Secretary Condoleezza Rice. His public commentary appears regularly in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and he is also a contributing editor at The Atlantic. So again, it's a great pleasure to have you here today, Eliot.
Thank you really for that very nice introduction. You could also add that I'm a failed political activist, but I'll leave that behind for now. It's a real pleasure to be here. Since I'm told that Secretary Mattis, you may be watching this on videotape, I just want to send my greetings and thank you for serving your country in the way you do. I'll just add that as the father of a soldier and a sailor, I'm glad you're there. So the book is called The Big Stick, The Limits of Soft Power and the Necessity of Military Force. Not an elegant title, but an unambiguous one. The Big Stick, of course, the phrase is associated most famously with Theodore Roosevelt. From a speech that he gave called National Duties. Actually, he was quoting a proverb, speak softly and carry a big stick. And I want to start with that speech by Roosevelt. As I said, the speech was called National Duties. He delivered it on September 3rd, 1901 at the Minnesota State Fair. And I think very deliberately chose to deliver that speech in the American heartland. He said, among other things, "We can be certain of one thing. Whether we wish it or not, we cannot avoid hereafter having duties to do in the face of other nations. All that we can do is to settle whether we shall perform those duties well or ill." 4 days later, President McKinley was shot. 2 weeks later, Theodore Roosevelt became President of the United States. He's a particularly interesting president because he was, I think, the first president who really saw a global role for the United States. The United States has been globally engaged since colonial days, but he's really the first one who I think saw a global role for this country. And he would not have been surprised, I think, at what happened in the wake of World War II. The price of that global engagement includes a military that is now an order of magnitude larger than the one over which he presided as president. It's cost us, that role's cost us something north of 600,000 dead, twice as many wounded, trillions in treasure. Why? Was it worth it then? And more importantly, is it going to be worth it in the years to come? And that's really what the book is about. I wrote the book for 3 reasons. The first is that it seemed to me that there was a missing debate that was bound to occur sooner or later. The missing debate was the debate that should have happened after the end of the Cold War. Because it's really the Cold War coming on top of World War II that left us with this military, which is an order of magnitude larger than that of the turn of the century, which left us with a global basing infrastructure with permanent alliances, commitments, and engagement in the use of force in virtually every corner of the world. You would have thought that when the Cold War ended, Americans would have had some kind of discussion of whether that role still made sense. It didn't happen. It didn't happen first because the 1990s were what my late colleague Fuad Ajami once called the period of the Great Picnic, when nothing seemed to be particularly serious. After all, other countries paid for the first Gulf War. We indeed made a small profit, financial profit from it. And casualties, by any historical standard, were very low. In the 2000s, of course, I think all of the oxygen was sucked out of the room by 9/11 and all the things that flowed from it. Afghanistan, Iraq, the war against global jihadi organizations. So that debate never occurred. And I was convinced when I was writing the book, and I'm more convinced now, that that debate has to be engaged in. That debate about first principles, about why the United States engages abroad, and to what extent in particular that should involve the use of force. The second reason to write the book was because I've always thought that there's frequently a false dichotomy that's drawn between diplomacy and force. Actually, of course, the two go hand in glove, but that dichotomy, where people talk about diplomatic solutions or military solutions, is reinforced by the fact that we have communities of experts in both areas who don't really talk to each other all that much and don't really engage with one another all that much. The people who do defense policy do defense, people who do foreign policy do that, whether it's in government or in the outside world. And I wanted to bridge that gap. And then thirdly, it seemed to me that there was a need to have a discussion about how we actually use force. George W. Bush did not expect to be a wartime president. In a certain way, I don't think Barack Obama expected to be a wartime president either. I don't believe President Trump thinks of himself really as a wartime president. Yet that's what all three are. And I believe President Trump's successor and his successor's successor will be wartime presidents as well. And yet, it seems to me we often talk as if we are still at peace, when in many ways we are not. So the book is about how should the United States develop and use military power. And it begins with the first order question. So the book is organized into 8 chapters. Much to my surprise, I got a nice review from the New York Times with the strangest compliment that I think I've ever gotten, which is that the book is as neatly organized as a bento box. Which usually makes me think of raw fish, but it was meant kindly, so I'll take it. The first chapter is why the United States? Why should we play the role that we play in the maintenance of global order? And I firmly believe that it is important to engage in that first order debate. And the way that I try to tackle that question is by looking at all the arguments that have been advanced to the effect that no, we should not. That either the era of force is receding, or that the natural operation of the balance of power somehow means the United States does not have to be as engaged as it once was, or that soft power can replace hard power, or that we're simply too incompetent to use force effectively, or that it's time for nation building at home. And I try to give those arguments as sympathetically and as accurately as I can, and then say why I don't really agree with them. The second chapter is called 15 Years of War. It was the hardest chapter to write. It seems to me you can't have a book about defense policy that doesn't take a hard look at the last 15 years. It was the hardest to write because I was involved somewhat on the periphery, but not entirely on the periphery, in the making of some of those decisions. I was in favor of the Iraq War. I had a son who fought in that war. I've known people who died in that war. So I try to engage with that as directly as I can. And I guess there are a number of bottom lines there, but one of the bottom lines is that yes, the war was a mistake. Not as grievous a mistake, perhaps, as some have made it out to be. It is important for us to confront the lessons of those wars, but it's also important for us not to obsess about those wars. And I think there's a kind of coming to terms with those conflicts which requires a level of political maturity across the political spectrum. People in favor of them, of the wars, and people who are against them, that I don't think is, unfortunately, all that much in evidence. The third chapter is called The American Hand. What is it that we bring to the table as opposed to other states and actors? And my conclusion there is better than anybody else's, but relatively weaker than it has been in the past, which means that we have to be shrewd and smart about how we develop and use power, including military power, because we don't have the margin of superiority that we used to have, and we never will. That's succeeded by 4 chapters on what I take to be the 4 large security challenges that we face: China, violent jihadis, what I call dangerous states, and I would put, say, Russia and Iran and North Korea, possibly some others in that category, and then a 4th chapter on ungoverned space and the commons. Those are the areas which it seems to me require the use of military power. Now, there are a lot of different little things in there, but one of the larger points that I try to make there is that the part of the fundamental nature of the American strategic challenge is that not only do those threats require different kinds of military power, they require different modes of thought. They require different strategic mindsets. So let's just take the war with violent jihadism. I approvingly quote a great Australian general, Peter Leahy, former commander of the chief of the Australian Army, who in an interview said, "We're in a 100-year war with radical Islam." And I don't know if it's exactly 100 years, but I think it's roughly right. And I thought hard about the meaning of that. I taught at the Naval War College for 4 years. By and large, with some exceptions, we primarily taught our students how to think about wars that lasted between 6 days and 6 years. I don't know that we ever taught our students how to think about wars that might last several generations. And I think it just requires a very different mindset, which we have not yet developed. So I think that's a major challenge. And then the 8th chapter, which I suppose might be the most useful, and if General Dunford or Secretary Mattis were to say, if I only have time to read one chapter, if that, I would say that I think would be the chapter I would like you to read. It's called The Logic of Hard Power. And it's about how should we think about actually using military force. And there I take as my foil the famous speech given by then Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger at the National Press Club, where he laid out his 6 principles for the use of force. Force should only be used for vital interests, as a last resort, and so on. And I go through those and I argue that actually, although they sound good, in practice, they're impossible. And that's an unworkable doctrine, the Weinberger doctrine. And so for the sake of parallel structure, I offer Cohen's 6 principles, which are a lot kind of gloomier and less happy, of which I'll just mention the first, which is taken directly from Clausewitz, and what I now think is as important as his dictum that war is the continuation of politics by other means. It's where he says, understand your war for what it is, not misunderstanding it for or attempting to turn it into something that is alien to its nature. That is the first of all strategic judgments and the most comprehensive. Now, that I could spend an hour unpacking that thought, and in fact, it's frequently a final exam question for my students. What does he mean by that? But I think it's an incredibly powerful idea, understanding your war for what it is, not mistaking it for or trying to turn it into something alien to its nature. And I would argue that many of the difficulties we've had in our recent wars is precisely because we've fallen into that Clausewitzian trap of misunderstanding our wars for something other than what they were. What are some of the other key features of the book? It's an ode, I would argue, to uncertainty. Despite the fact that Hal Brands, who is, I'm sure, known to you as a highly respected and much liked colleague of mine, I don't believe in grand strategy. I don't think it's possible. And I think we're in a world of actually quite remarkable discontinuity, and that is one of the great challenges that falls upon this department above all. I do believe we have to define and order our problems. I worry, for example, that we will probably pay too much attention to the Middle East when other strategic problems are larger and ultimately more consequential. I accept the value, but also the limits of soft power. It's not a trashing of the idea of soft power. It's an insistence on its limits. Soft power is real. It's one of the reasons why it is a good idea to have students from all over the world study in the United States, for example. But I think we have to remember that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of 9/11, got his bachelor's degree in North Carolina. It's not a guarantee of anything. I believe, finally, that one of the challenges that we're going to have in the future is restoring something that was actually a central aspect of American strategic thought going back to colonial times, and that is the idea of mobilization. The idea that whatever the forces are that you have today, for the war in which you're going to embark, you're going to have to generate more and different. And I don't mean by that I really want to see a very active selective service program, but I do mean that we have to think about how we can tap the resources of this country, the material resources, the intellectual resources, the human resources, much faster than we have in the past, and bring them to bear on whatever the fight is. And I think mobilizational thinking is something that is really, in certain respects, other than some very narrow technical ones, has kind of slipped out of how we think about things. Well, there's a lot more in the book. I'll just conclude by saying one other thing. One of the things that struck me as I wrote the book, because it was written really at the end of the Obama presidency, is the paradox of that presidency. I was quite critical of the Obama administration, but I gave President Obama full credit for sincerity and for a well thought out concept of what he thought the United States should be in the world. There is no question that he wanted to shut down the Iraq War once and for all. I think he believed that he could basically bring us to the end of the Afghan mission with the exception of some residual kind of training and support. I think he envisioned the end of the war with Al-Qaeda. I think he felt that we were much too prone to use military power abroad and that it was time to pull back or to retrench. But at the end of that administration, where do we stand? Where did we stand? We went longer in Afghanistan and we're ramping back up as he left office. He launched what is, in fact, the third Iraq War in my lifetime. This is a different Iraq War than that of 2003 and its sequel. So this is the third Iraq War, which is going on even now. He participated in an undeclared war launched by our European allies in Libya. He expanded by an order of magnitude the largest campaign of assassination known in human history, which I'm basically in favor of, let me stipulate. He ordered the United States Navy to sail what some people thought was provocatively close to Chinese man-made islands in the South China Sea. Reintroduced heavy forces to Europe for the first time since the Cold War. And what will he be blamed for? Well, when a tombstone is put up on George W. Bush's foreign policy, in capital letters at the top, well, there'll be one word that's chiseled there, Iraq. When a tombstone is put up on Barack Obama's foreign policy, there'll be one big word there in capital letters, chiseled, Syria. The war in which he chose not to engage. None of this happened because Obama was not highly, and the people around him were not highly intelligent, hadn't thought things through. I think they were caught by the logic of American power and by the logic of the world as it is. I think this current administration will, in various ways, discover that that's the case too. And so, in the end, the nature of the American choice is, do we engage belatedly, bloodily, and semi-unsuccessfully, or altogether unsuccessfully, or prudently? And so at the end, I would say Theodore Roosevelt was right. All we can do is to settle whether we shall perform these duties well or ill. So that concludes my, my remarks. I'm happy to take questions about anything at all. A bashful Sir.
Clark Tully, OSD policy. One of the characteristics of war in the last half century has been, in most cases, a lack of the decisive outcome. Do you see that as an enduring characteristic of war going into the future, or do you think the scale and scope of conflict might be different and you might, again, return to more decisive, definitive outcomes as we've seen earlier?
So I have several different lives, and one of them is as a colonial historian, self-taught. Not all that good, but I've always been keenly interested in our colonial history. And I think actually there's a lot more that you can learn about the American way of war and the nature of warfare itself by going back to the 17th and 18th centuries. And one of the things you realize there is those wars were not particularly conclusive. Some of them were quite extended. By the way, everything you want, hybrid war, you want hybrid war, come with me to upstate New York and we'll wander around Fort Ticonderoga and I'll talk to you endlessly about it. So I think part of the problem it's not the problem of American military history, but the way we understand our military history is we think the Civil War, kind of forget about World War II, World War I, and World War II. Really good, definitive, clean ends. And that's sort of the model. That's why there was even some really completely idiotic talk at the end of the first Gulf War of getting the Iraqis to sign on the quarterdeck of USS Missouri. It was really quite delusional because, there was that desire to recap, well, this is what a war ought to look like. But that's not what war looks like throughout most of history. And I think part of what we're discovering is we're back actually in more normal periods of warfare, where it can just go on for a bloody long time. And there's round one, and the British win that round, and round two, the French win that round, and round three, the British win that round. And in between, there's all kinds of skullduggery that's going on, plus also people traveling back and forth and speaking one another's languages and enjoying one another's cuisines, and British enjoying French cuisine, not really. Doesn't really work the other way around. So I think we're in a much more normal period. I do think we're not in a period where we're going to see decisive victory. It is striking to me how much that persists, whether it was the Obama administration talking about Al-Qaeda, the way we talk now about the Islamic State, which I'm not going to call Daesh same way I'm not going to call Paris Paris, and I'm not going to call Munich München. You know, we're not going to obliterate these guys. Even when we take Raqqa and, you know, eliminate West, it's just going to morph into something else, and it's going to continue. And you're misleading the American people, I think, if you promise them decisive victory, and perhaps most important, you fool yourself. And that really goes to my first proposition about thinking about the use of force. You know, don't mistake the war for something that is alien to its nature.
Sure. Sir, Ken here at G2. If you subscribe to the Australian Chief of Staff's position of this being a 100-year war, are we properly organized for that? Because your use of force doesn't really talk about, does it? I don't know. I'm going to look at information operations and how we do that so poorly. I remember Bill Gates testifying once how the country that invented the internet can be so poor at this.
Right. No, I don't think we are. So as I mentioned, you know, one part of my career is as a failed political activist. I was one of Governor Romney's senior advisors, and if he had won, I was supposed to be the Deputy National Security Advisor. And part of my task during the transition planning the summer before the election was to think about how the NSC staff system was organized. And I began looking at earlier versions to include the Eisenhower administration had something called the Psychological Warfare Board, which, you know, was a quite explicit reaction to the fact that the Cold War is something different, that there's kind of an ideological competition here, and that somehow we have to deal with it. Now, the exact mechanism wasn't going to be the right one for that, but something like that, for example, some place where you do try to coordinate that part of it, which is not simply about killing people. I mean, part of the problem is we are really very, very good at killing the right people, by and large. And so we've kind of fallen in love with killing the right people. And as we've discovered, killing the right people moderates the problem and to some extent contains it, but it doesn't really help you address the more fundamental issues that are there. So I would say probably not. And again, more importantly, I would say we need to educate the planners and even the operators who are going to be in that war with the understanding that those are the kinds of time horizons they have to think about. Back there.
Two questions. One, when you were talking about the gravestone, I thought you were going to say ISIS. Was that sort of interchangeable with Syria, and why or why not? And number two, in your research, did you discover anything that changed the direction of your thinking?
I'm thinking about that last one. It wasn't so much the research, it was that second chapter, and thinking hard about Iraq, and just forcing myself to say something that I think I knew inside. But, you know, if you've been part of an administration, it's hard. It's hard to say, you know, we really screwed up. And if you've said you've been in favor of something which, you know, a lot of good people got killed and hurt, and you're not sure it was the right decision, that's very hard to say too. But I would say that was an emotional struggle more than an intellectual one. To the first, no, I'd quite deliberately said Syria, because ISIS, you know, and I'm not nearly a kind of in-depth expert that I'm sure some of you are. ISIS is an outgrowth of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which has gone in a different direction, to be sure. It is one of the kinds of radical Islamist movements that we're going to be dealing with for a long time. I mean, I think, and I said at the time that the Obama administration, and I continue to believe the Obama administration quite badly mishandled our disengagement from Iraq. Did not have to be the way it was. I mean, because my feeling about Iraq is, you know, I was there quite a bit in 2008, and my feeling is the country was on a fragile trajectory to something kind of okay as long as we remained actively engaged. And that wasn't just my view, it was the view of people like Ryan Crocker and Jim Jeffrey and folks like that. No, it's Syria. It's Syria because for a number of reasons. The first is just the scale of the human tragedy. 500,000 dead, 5 million refugees, another 6 million internally displaced people. Use of chemical weapons, unpunished. It's the red line that vanished. It's the wave of refugees going into Europe. It's the overt presence of Iran and Russia there. It's the long-term consequences of the real obliteration of a state that was a pretty nasty state, but with it a good part, I think, of Middle Eastern order. All those things. And so I believe that was a multi-dimensional failure, which is really, really consequential, and that we're going to be living with for a long time.
In the back there.
Sir Tim Muchmore from the Army Staff. If Iraq was wrong, what, in retrospect, do you wish you had advised President George Bush to do after 9/11?
So, to be clear, I first met President Bush in 2006. So, you know, I was just another guy scribbling op-eds after 9/11.
But if you had been in position to advise the president right after 9/11?
I think, well, let me this is not trying to weasel out of the question, but let me just begin by sort of setting the conditions for it, which is what historians will understand about the Iraq War, which contemporaries particularly who are opposed to it don't fully get, is the just kind of the feel of things after 9/11. And among other things, people's tolerance for risk. So Tony Blair, now completely disgraced in his own country, actually said this very well to the Chilcote Commission. He said, you know, the facts were the same about Iraq before 9/11 and after 9/11, but our willingness to tolerate risk had been profoundly altered. So that's one thing, and I think people really need to remind themselves of that. Second thing I would say about that is, you know, everybody needs to remember that there was going to be a turning point on Iraq anyway, because the inspections regime was over and the sanctions regime was collapsing. And so the prospect was of the return of Saddam Hussein. The third thing, which didn't affect me as much, I know it affected some people, is people found it very hard to accept the idea that Al-Qaeda, you know, a bunch of guys in a cave, could have pulled off 9/11. And so there was an understandable but probably incorrect will to believe that there was a much larger Iraqi hand in all this than there was. So all that said, I think what I would have said on Iraq was, I mean, it was right to deal with Iraq. It was right because that regime was going to destabilize that region. It was a dangerous regime. I think I would have tried to do it in a way that would have kept more of our allies on board. I think I would not have just gone ahead and ordered the invasion. I think I would have applied, said as uncomfortable as it would be for all those American troops in the desert, try to apply an extended squeeze on the regime of Saddam Hussein with a view to eventually bringing it down rather than launching the invasion. You know, and I guess the other thing I would have said to him privately is our biggest challenge is in a way going to be ourselves and the internal divisions within your administration, particularly between your Secretary of State and your Secretary of Defense. And you need to be really sure that, you know, we're able to execute this together. You know, ultimately my view is it's politicians and political people who bear ultimate responsibility. I also, though, do think that the institutions of the United States government, including very much the armed services, have to ask themselves harder questions than they have about how they dealt, not so much with the initial phase of fighting, but with everything that followed, from rotating out the headquarters to basically saying, well, we're going to hand over the administration of this place to this thing called ORHA, which we've never heard of, that we don't do military government, forgetting that we absolutely do military government. So there's a whole bunch of errors which I talk about, which it wouldn't have occurred to me, to be perfectly honest, we would make, but which I think we did. Or even the way we thought about rebuilding Iraqi forces. I mean, you could go on and on. So I think I probably would have pressed him, look harder at our side, and ask, are we really ready for this one? That's kind of a mushy answer, but I think that's the best I can do.
Sure. Kevin Wolfhorst on UG2. You listed China as the first chapter of the security challenges. Could you provide a summary of the nature of that threat and what you think the U.S. should be doing to?
So I think China is the big geopolitical competitor. The jihadis are a serious problem, and we're going to, as I said, we're going to be at war with them. I don't think they can really, fundamentally threaten the world order. I don't think they can fundamentally threaten us as long as we don't let ourselves kind of go crazy and suspend civil liberties and so forth. Russia is a weak state with a lot of nuclear weapons and a bad attitude, but the innate weaknesses of the Russian regime are what they are. North Korea is very specific. What China has is, obviously, it's an economy that is comparable to our own in size and sophistication, which does not accept the basic kind of order that is the one that we with the help of others, established after World War II. And it is all of these, I think, are doable propositions from the point of view of American foreign policy and strategy. Let me be clear about that. But in that case, you really have to be both shrewd and forceful in what you do to kind of keep your allies together so that you can counterbalance China. You're not going to prevent the rise of China, but to be able to some extent, contain it, but certainly to counterbalance it. Some of those things are military. It's one of the reasons why I think sequester has really been awful, and we need a bigger Navy. I think that's pretty clear. We probably need a somewhat different kind of Air Force for that. But we also need things like TPP. And it's one of the reasons why I was horrified during this last presidential campaign to hear both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump denounce Trans-Pacific Partnership. That was a strategic more than a economic document in many ways. And it having fallen apart, what are the things you see? You see the Australians signing deals with the Chinese, you see the Japanese signing deals with the Europeans, and you see the United States losing influence and leverage. So that, do I think we're going to fight a war with China? No. Could I imagine it happening? Yes. I mean, actually, I can imagine all kinds of wars coming our way. I don't wish for any of them, but can I imagine them happening? Yeah.
Jim Rockwood from AZ Now. Could outline another chapter of Supreme Command using the current administration and President Trump, Secretary Madison's recent military experience, and then our commanders that we currently have in the field.
This president is so far out of the norm that I don't think I could. I mean, I don't mean to be discourteous. I really meant what I just said.
Sometimes the answer is just no. Jay Fawcett, Air Force Legislative Liaison. Have we got the lexicon wrong? To expand on what you said earlier, those three examples of clear wins are industrial age wars.
Yep.
There were wars before the industrial age. We are now arguably post-industrial age. Should we be speaking more about conflict? And in that conflict regime, balancing all sources of power, whether it's military or cultural. We carry great power in many forms, but we don't like to talk about power because that might infer we're imperialists, and imperialists are bad.
Well, for sure, I think we're in a world where power itself is a lot more fluid than perhaps it's been for a while. Although, you know, for almost anything you look out there, you can find precedents. I do think one of the things that happened in the Cold War and then the immediate post-Cold War period is that we ended up creating what I call in the book strategic pixie dust. You know, with phrases like end states or the way people sometimes invoke deterrence, as if, you know, there's always a temptation, I think, in many walks of life to magical thinking. And one form of magical thinking is, you know, if I just say the word deterrence, my problems go away. But your problems won't go away. They'll be very different. So let's just take the North Korean issue right now, which is obviously a matter of debate. And basically, as I think was pretty clear we were always going to end up, you know, you're going to have two awful choices. You're going to live with North Korea with ICBMs, with nuclear weapons on them that can reach the continental United States, or you're going to launch a preemptive war to take that out. Those are basically your only choices. I mean, there's, you know, the historian in me was just kind of amused when this administration says, I know what we'll do is we'll get the Chinese to make them stop. Like every administration since James Madison hasn't had that thought about North Korea. And they've all failed. You know, you're going to face that choice. Well, one of the kind of the strategic pixie dust would be deterrence. Well, we're just going to deter them by, you know, the way we did in the Cold War. We'll threaten to mass, you know, mutual assured destruction or some variation on that. But that's actually not going to capture the reality of what our posture would have to be towards a North Korea that actually could land nuclear weapons on the United States, because of the nature of that regime, because of our fears of its instability, because of our, what we would think, I hope we would think, about the mental stability of its leadership and the way it views the world, and about their propensity to take risk. What it means is you'd have to have this kind of hair trigger ability to launch a preemptive strike, probably with nuclear weapons, I think. That's a pretty awful thought too. You know, at the moment I'm thinking that is a less awful thought than launching a war in the Korean Peninsula, which we may still do. Maybe it isn't, I don't know. That's the sort of argument that the Secretary and the President get paid to make. But the point is that the word deterrent, if you sprinkle the word deterrence over North Korea hoping to make it go away, you're using strategic pixie dust. And it won't work.
So do we need to change the vocabulary?
Yes, I agree. I do.
Sure.
As a Chen can say to now, you expressed some skepticism about the concept of strategic deterrence. I'm sorry, not of grand strategy.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you thought that there needs to be something like a long telegram for the China era, and if so, what might that include, and if not, why not?
Yeah. Well, first, you know, I mean, I've got a whole separate lecture on grand strategy. You can invite me back to give that one. Often when people are talking about grand strategy, all they really mean is policy. You know, what is our long-term policy towards China? I think the first order question in dealing with any potential opponent, and certainly with China, is it's the great question that was posed by Butch Cassidy to the Sundance Kid in that great movie, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. If you remember, you know, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid are these two reasonably benign train robbers in the Wild West. They hold up a train and they've got the loot, and all of a sudden one of the cars opens up and these dozen guys ride out and begin chasing them. And, you know, there's a lot of kind of running up and down canyons and stuff like that. They do all the old tricks, you know, going through the water, leaping off the cliff, doubling back on their tracks and so on, and they're still pursuing them. And this goes on for a while. And at some point, Butch Cassidy, Paul Newman, turns to the Sundance Kid, Robert Redford and says, who are those guys? And I think that's actually one of the most important strategic questions you can ask. It's, for the gentleman from G2, it's a question that actually the intelligence community finds it very hard to answer. So think about what is Paul Newman asking when he says, who are those guys? He's not asking how many of them there are. They can count. That's easy. There are half a dozen of them. He's not asking what they're riding, horses. He's not asking what weapons they have, Colt 45s, Winchesters, Remingtons, whatever it is. He's asking something very different. So what motivates them? Why are they so persistent? Why has it been harder for us to shake them than to shake other people who've come after us? And I think that is something that we often lack in the federal government. When I was counselor, I remember I kept on pestering the intelligence community. Can you tell me how the war in Afghanistan looks to the Quetta Shura? And I never got an answer. I could get answers about how many Taliban there were, and bases, and what kind of IEDs, and infiltration routes, and all that sort of stuff. I couldn't get an answer to the question, who are those guys? I think that's the most important question to ask about the Chinese. And the big debates are effectively about things like, well, do we think that the Chinese are on this kind of inevitable path to liberalization as they get rich, with a communist party that is opening itself out and democratizing in a variety of ways? Or do we think, no, this is fundamentally a communist party, and they really have absolutely no belief in the rule of law as we understand it, don't think that they ever will, and they really would like to drive us out of Asia? Now, as you might guess, I tend to think the second one is more likely to be true than the first one. But those are the first order questions I think we have to ask ourselves. And I believe often when people are writing these kinds of very ambitious strategy documents, they skip over that part, which is the really hard part. It is, to go back to Iraq, I think that's one of the questions we didn't really ask ourselves. Who are those guys? I mean, again, vivid memories when I was on the Defense Policy Board in like 2003, 2004, who are those guys? Bitter enders, former regime elements. That's what I am now. We were really misunderstood who those guys were. We didn't really have a grip on what had happened to that society during years of civil war and sanctions and all the rest. So I'd say that's where I think it's really necessary to start. Yeah?
Well, not the answer. Really diverse tool that we have, which is basically the similar question is around nations. Why do we see
Well, let me just say something on the second point. In a way, this is what people also said about Yugoslavia. What the scholars of nationalism and state formation will tell you is most states are to some extent artificial. And the question is whether people accept them over time. If Abraham Lincoln had stopped a bullet in 1862, which could have happened, there were assassination attempts against him. And, the conduct of the Civil War on the Union side had fallen into the hands of Hannibal Hamlin, a perfectly worthy mediocrity. The chances are there would have been an independent Confederate States of America. And everybody would now say, well, of course it was folly to try to keep the southern states, which had a separate culture, separate accents, you name it, separate cuisine, as part of the United States. There was a different nation. Didn't turn out that way. You get the states that you've got, and I think it's not that there is a natural alternative out there that is really clear. This is what people found when they did the settlement after World War I. Okay, if you say, okay, we're going to break up the Austro-Hungarian Empire and we'll have real nation states like Czechoslovakia, where there are, except the Czechs have like 1.5 million Germans who don't really think of themselves as Czechs. And there are also some Hungarians there who the Hungarians think belong to them, and so on. So I think pretty much all the states in that part of the world are artificial. And if you simply step back and say, we don't really care if they fall apart, I think you really are setting yourselves up for chaos, because there's not a set of natural states that you're going to find. Sir?
Yeah, Dr. Cohen, Luis Perez, I'm interning here at OSD Policy, and I'm wondering, for all of us in the room, if you could talk to us about what you think, how we should think about how big the stick should be, and how it, like, what characteristics it should have, given all the threats and challenges.
Bigger than it is now. So one thing that I think is a little bit simple-minded, but I'm still in favor of it, is, and this is completely crude and unintellectual and unsophisticated, but I think makes perfect sense, is if we really thought about our defense budget as almost like a fixed percentage of GDP, like 4% of GDP. Now, you still want to spend that wisely, don't get me wrong, but I think you'd be much better off basically doing, I mean, that's after all what we ask of the Europeans, right? Saying we want you to spend 2% of your GDP on defense. So if it's good for the goose, why isn't it good for the gander? And something like 4% of GDP would be roughly right. Now, beyond that, as you look at the world as we have it, I think I've made it pretty clear, like a much bigger Navy. I mean, I'd like all the services to be bigger, but particularly the Navy. And Air Force, at the risk of alienating everybody associated with the F-35 program, I really think it was a terrible idea to kill the F-22. Pretty clearly, what we need in large parts of the world is really long-range strike with, the ability to drop lots of stuff. That's not what we're getting with the F-35, so it's not just size, but what the composition is. But I also, I'm very serious when I say mobilizational kind of thinking. So whatever the size of the Army is in particular, what are the programs that you have kind of in the background in peacetime where you can really recruit the kinds of people that you need? I'll give you just one example from Iraq. So, you occupy a ruined Iraq, or a really ruined Afghanistan, and somebody's got to run these cities and towns and stuff. So what do my Army friends want? I felt this particularly keenly as soon as I put on a pinstripe suit and became a State Department official. They want the State Department there. So why isn't the State Department doing this? And my response was always, when Hurricane Katrina obliterates New Orleans, does the beleaguered mayor of New Orleans call up Foggy Bottom and say, please send us 4 ambassadors to help us sort this out? Of course not. The State Department doesn't do that. Who might you tap for that kind of thing? Well, you might do what you did in World War II. There are loads of really patriotic city managers and mayors and councilmen and local bureaucrats who I am quite sure if there's a national emergency and the word goes out that, the United States Army is looking to direct commission a whole bunch of people for, let's say, 2 years, if that, maybe less, maybe for 18 months, give you 3 to 6 months of training so you're not a danger to yourself and to other people, and then send you off to Crete to help do something that's kind of akin to what you normally do, which is run a city. That was impossible for us to do for some reason. A mobilizational story from the State Department. At one point, the great thing about being counselors, I could meddle in everybody's business. So at one point, I was just curious. We've been in Afghanistan for a while. We'll probably be in Afghanistan for a while. I wonder how many Pashto speakers we have in the Department of State. So I ran that number to earth. The total was 9. Of whom only 2 were actually foreign service officers. The rest were, like a janitor who had grown up speaking Pashto or a computer specialist who had grown up speaking Pashto. So wow, that's not that good. I mean, this is 2007. We went there in 2001. But it must be a difficult language when we have loads of people in the pipeline. So I checked at the Foreign Service Institute. How many people do we have learning Pashto? 3. And I asked the senior bureaucrats, well, why is that the case? So, well, it's not going to be useful to them in any other assignment. So that's it. It's only useful if you want to win a war. And in that respect, the State Department couldn't handle a mobilizational concept like what we need to do is teach a lot of people a difficult language really fast. Again, something we did with ease during World War II. When I was an undergraduate, I was taught by one of the great sinologists of the time who was also fluent in Japanese. And the way he got interested in Asia, he was a poor kid from Boston, gets drafted into the Army. They discovered he had an aptitude for languages. They taught him Japanese. He ended up translating the Japanese surrender message. And there were a lot of people like him. We just don't think this way anymore. And I think that's really what we're really going to need. I can take one more, and then I promise to let you all go. Yeah?
My name is Ty Anthony from OSD Policy, and I'm intrigued about your question on debate and how the role of people should be. Should there be routine declarations of war, or we just seem to be on this kind of autopilot with continuing resolutions and judgment of that?
I think it's critically important to have congressional support for the use of force. And that's, I think there's been a certain amount of, how can I put it charitably, cowardice in both the legislative and the executive branches about pursuing that. It is ultimately a decision by the American people. I also think there are limits to how much you can wage war without the active support of the American people. And you better have a president who can get on national television and be believed, and who is continually making the case to the American people. And this is actually a good point to end. This does tie into my book, Supreme Command. I think one of the functions of that highest level of leadership is to explain to the American people, to make the case to the American people, this is why we're sending not your sons and daughters, because let's face it, you're not sending many people's sons and daughters, but you're sending Americans off somewhere, to go into harm's way. This is why it's important. This is how this conflict is going. This is why I'm pursuing the course I am. This is what this war has been like. This is what this war is about. And you can't just do it in 1 or 2 speeches. It has to be something that is persistent. I just think this is a core aspect of presidential leadership, and I can't say that any recent president has done particularly well at it. Even the president that I served, who I admired in many respects, George W. Bush. And I don't think this guy can do it either, unfortunately. Well, on that happy note, thank you very much. Oh, thank you. That's great. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming. It was the talk was wonderful, but I think the Q&A was just as good. So thank you for staying. And if anyone wants to come up afterwards and ask Eliot a few more questions, he's agreed to stay around.
Happy to do that. Thank you for hosting me.